Hello, everybody. I have a question for you. What is this?
सिखा तू पकड़ बन के बंदा और तेरी असीलियत सी ओए सिखा और करतारपुरा गद्दार दे पुत्रा ओए गद्दारा खालिस्तान दे गद्दारा और खालिस्तान दे गद्दारा ए दे
I mean, there was the environment impact assessment that happened recently, and which would have impacted huge amounts of animals and forests in India and tribal people in India, and that was barely discussed in the news. And then there was the national education policy, which created sweeping changes across all sections of the education in India and had a lot of people opposing it, and that had barely any coverage in India. There were huge amounts of floods in Bihar, Assam, barely any coverage. There is police brutality in South India. It's become 1 year since Kashmir has become one of the worst places in the world, and still, this is what we show. We dug up and were more critical about the news of Sushant Singh Rathor's death. We investigated more about his death than things that would actually affect a huge amount of people. What happened? We are going to try to understand why the national news media is so bad through the learnings from the book Manufacturing Consent by Noam Chomsky and Edward Herman. Chomsky and Herman released this book on 1988, and it was a landmark book. It stated that even though countries which do not have a state propaganda TV news channel, the privately owned, seemingly independent news channels work in a way like propaganda for the state. To understand how a privately owned company can work as the propaganda for the state, we need to understand what the state actually does. Chomsky and Herman says there are 5 filters that the private news companies go through to make sure the news becomes into kind of a propaganda for the state. So we will go through these 5 filters. Before that, we need to understand a very crucial concept, and that is called class conflict. Let's take a pencil for example. To make a pencil, we need certain raw materials like wood and graphite, and we need glue to stick the graphite and the wood together. We need a factory to shape the wood, shape the graphite, and all that stuff. So, the stuff that produces stuff, here the wood, graphite, the factory, and the glue, is called the means of production. But with just the means of production, you cannot create a pencil. You need labor. You need workers to work with the means of production to create the pencil. The pencil always has an higher value than the raw materials put together. That is how you get profit by selling the pencil. This higher value is called surplus value, and the surplus value only exists because the worker worked on the means of production. Now, in capitalism, the means of production is owned by a person. Let's say he is the capitalist. The capitalist's goal is to keep as much of the surplus value with him as possible and to give as little in wages to the workers as possible. For the workers, their goal is to keep as much of the surplus value they generated with themselves as possible and to give as little to the capitalist as much as possible. The goals of the worker and the goals of the capitalist are diametrically opposed, which means For one person to win, the other one must lose. For the capitalist to gain, the worker must lose. For the worker to gain, the capitalist must lose. This diametrically opposed system is called class conflict. This is the class conflict that exists in capitalism. This class conflict is so dangerous that it constantly threatens to break capitalism. It is like two magnets repelling each other constantly. To keep them together, you need constant force from your hands. This constant force in class conflict is the state, religion, and the news media. That is how the news media serves the state and inherently also serves the capitalist system. So, to recap, there is a person who owns to make a living and there's a person who works to make a living. And the goals of these two people are diametrically opposed to each other and is always in conflict. This is called class conflict. And to keep these two classes together and a system functioning, you need a lot of external forces to keep the system functioning. And these external forces are the state, the religion, the news media, and etc. So, if you want to do propaganda for the state in a capitalist economy, you are basically doing propaganda for the capitalist system to keep the class conflict intact. Yeah, right? Okay. So, let's go to the first filter. First filter is who owns these national news media companies. If we see, the national news media is almost always owned by super rich business people, and in a lot of cases they own much bigger businesses and the news media is a part of their business. Why this is a filter is because when we see class conflict, we discussed that when the worker wins, the owner should lose something, and when the owner wins, the worker should lose something. So, when there is a situation that happens when the worker wins, if we frame the news according to the owner, it will be a negative news. But if we frame the news according to the worker, it will be a positive news. Because extremely wealthy people own this news media in India, the framework of news is almost always framed towards the capitalistic point of view. So, anything that is seen as positive, you can most probably take it as a negative for the workers. It is not always the case, it is not so blatant, but we can keep this in mind when we look into the national news media, especially owned by big businesses. Filter number 2 is advertising. So, like any other business, the news sells a product to a customer. The product is an audience and the customer are advertisers. The news is just a way to reach an audience, and this audience should be favorable to the advertisers, right? So, if the advertisers want to advertise in your news channel, they will make sure that the people who are watching your news channel have the buying power to buy the products that is being advertised. That is why news channels usually do not show the grievances of the extremely poor or the problems of the extremely poor places in India. Floods in Assam and floods in Bihar were not big news, but the news of Sushant Singh Rathor's death was big because Bollywood gossip is something that the affluent and people with buying power are interested in. This is how advertising streamlines the audience towards a very affluent people. Filter number 3, cost management and sources. So, if we look at the news, most of the national news happens in a very few places like New Delhi, Mumbai, maybe Chennai and Bangalore, but it is on very densely populated places that most of the news happens. Why is this? Well, it costs a lot to send reporters and to keep them there and wait for the news to happen in different places. So they may so to cut costs, news companies send reporters to only a few places where they know there is constant news happening. They do it in Mumbai, where there is Bollywood and a lot of rich people and a lot of affluent and powerful people, and they do it in Mumbai, where most of the political news comes out. That is why the reporters are always stationed there, according to the national news. And this leads to another problem. Fact checking is also very expensive, and digging into a government's press release is also very expensive. This leads to the news media becoming a sort of a mouthpiece for the government. A good example would be the coronavirus relief fund that the government had released. Narendra Modi came forward and he said 20,000 crore rupees is going to be the relief fund for the coronavirus pandemic, and this number of 20,000 crore started drumming out everywhere without any critical look into what that 20,000 rupees actually was. A lot of it was not even included in the 20,000 rupees, and a lot of it was already spent for the coronavirus pandemic. But because the news media is not really willing to look into all this, but just being a mouthpiece media for the government press releases actually works more than enough, a lot of news media start becoming a mouthpiece for the government. They don't really fact check. The other type of problem is experts. There are a lot of experts who come in. They are called experts, but they aren't really. They are just mouthpieces for either the state or the corporations that come and talk, and they a lot of times spread misinformation. But because they are considered experts, people do not dig in and question into them. This is the problem with the filter number 3. Filter number 4 is flack. When even though there are so many filters, one or two news channels would go beyond this and start digging into some stuff, and that is when the state steps in and starts filing lawsuits, arresting journalists, creating communal problems to make people themselves be against journalism. This happened recently in New Delhi with the caravan reporters. This is filter number 4, flack. When you are seen to go out of the bounds, you are put back into your place by the state and by a lot of people who support the state. And filter number 5 is a boogeyman. You will always have a common enemy in the media, be it communism in the USA, be it China and Pakistan in India, be it Muslims in India for some TV channels. This boogeyman is always there to distract us from the material conditions of most people. This is why when there were a lot of problems going on with the coronavirus pandemic, stuff like this became viral.
Suddenness, the sheer suddenness of the move, the unexpected nature of the move, the unpredictability of the move, the fact that there was no warning to the Chinese. They don't know what hit them. Now the Chinese will know.
Just, mwah. I love you, Arnab. So, these are the 5 filters that the media goes through to make sure it in the end becomes propaganda for the state and the capitalist system. How can we fight against this? Well, there are a few steps that I would consider important. Number 1 would be to not trust the national media immediately. When they come out with headlines, do not make assumptions with that headlines. It is almost always not dug in enough. It does not have enough information, and it almost always is somehow lacking in a lot of detail. So do not make your assumptions with the first headline that comes out in the national media. Number 2, support local and small scale journalism companies. Support these companies that run on the internet, because the internet has democratized news in a very big way. Support these companies which are very small scale, which have constantly criticized the government and looked into each and every plan with a critical eye and not just been a mouthpiece for the government. We should also support these news media which have a track record of correcting themselves when they are wrong. Support people who take the news and compile it and make it in a more understandable way for us to dissect. This is why John Oliver's Last Week Tonight and Hassan Minhaj's Patriot Act are really popular because they run in streaming platforms instead of news networks, so they are not reliant on advertising. So the news they are giving is almost always very well researched and made sure it is objective. Another example is the Indian company called Academy Magazine, who do the same type of work that John Oliver and Hassan Minhaj does, but in a text and web form. They have an Instagram page which I will link below. So to sum up, number one, the news media is owned by capitalists and extremely rich people, so the workers' plights will not be as much shown in the news. Number two, advertising makes sure the audience that the news is made for is of an affluent and people with buying power. Number three, fact checking and reporting is expensive and they try to do it as less as possible. Number four, there is always flack from the government if you go out of line. And number five, there will always be a common boogeyman among all these news media. So